this one I'm going to be looking at 1980s Poly Synths that you can still get for less than £200. Now these days I think that probably equates to the same in dollars and euros, but there's going to be some kind of variation on that. So check your local listings for actual prices. Before I start, if you'd like to support the channel, then please check out some of my music on Bandcamp and streaming services. I'll also leave links in the description for that. With that out of the way, let's get started. First of all, is there anything special about the 80s in particular? Well, in my opinion there is, because you started the decade with mainly analog instruments and you ended the decade with fully functioning digital workstations. It's an incredible transition in a relatively short period of time. There were so many different types of synthesis which were employed, mainly spurred on by FM being developed by Yamaha, and therefore all the other manufacturers trying to find angles so they could make their products more unique. It was a very creative period. So if money were no object, you could certainly get an incredible selection of synthesizers, but we're going to stick to the under £200 mark. Now, as you can imagine, that doesn't leave you much room, but it's still possible to get decent synthesizers from that period for that sort of money. And if you're really lucky, you might even be able to get something a bit better. So I'm going to go through the main areas of synth, and it should become clear what I mean by that as we go on. Okay, let's talk about the CZ series. That seems to be something that I cover a lot on this channel. So the first two CZs were released in 1984. You had the CZ101 with the mini keyboard. I think that's still quite useful for a modern minimal setup. And then you had the larger CZ1000, which was a 4-octave keyboard. So later on they released the CZ3000, which had additional chorus, and then they released the 5000, which had a sequencer. And then eventually they released the CZ1, which dropped the sequencer but added velocity and aftertouch. The CZs have a unique form of synthesis called phase distortion, and as you might expect, it does deliver a particular sound. It doesn't sound the same as FM, but it does sound very digital, which has caused some confusion. So let's talk about how well it might fit into your setup. So in terms of programmability, I've always found it relatively easy to use. You've got a lot of dedicated buttons for dedicated functions, and therefore the necessity to menu dive is really quite small. So for a digital synthesizer, it's reasonably easy to program. Plus, the nature of the synthesis is very similar to subtractive synthesis, so it's, as long as you're familiar with that, you won't have any problem getting your head around phase distortion. The next question is, do you really need a CZ synth? Now, there are two emulators. Plugin Boutique does one, and so does Arturia. And they're both very good. And as someone pointed out recently, they don't weigh 15 kilograms. So you may want to consider getting an emulator instead of getting the real thing. Having said that, do they sound exactly like an original CZ? No, they don't. Not really. Sometimes they get incredibly close, but for some strange reason, occasionally they just kind of drift off and do their own thing. Is that going to be usable? Is that going to be good enough? Well, I suppose it depends how authentic you want your experience to be. And it's a question which I keep asking myself, but at the moment I'm hanging on to my CZ1. So the next thing is the flexibility of the synth. As I said, they have quite a unique sound to them. So if you were going to have a single piece of vintage hardware, is this the one to have? I guess it depends how much you like the sound, but will it be able to cover everything you need to do in a mix? Not really. If you were to do, say, a whole track or even a whole album using CZ, it would sound very CZ. The other thing, which is really a minor point, is that it only has chorus as an effect. I don't see that as a big issue. It's not like having a Juno chorus or something like that. The chorus works, but as a general rule, I don't use it. I tend to just record the CZ dry and then add effects from somewhere else. So a quick word on the relative prices. I've put this into the £200 bracket because I have seen them going for less than 200, but I think you're going to be hard pressed, particularly to get the CZ1 for £200. That's how much mine cost, but that was a few years ago. And the CZ101 is particularly desirable because of its small size. So I think the most likely area that you will get a cheaper one will be the 1000, the 3000 or the 5000. Right, on to the next synth then. Let's have a look at the Kawai K1. Now, it used to be the case that you could get quite a few Kawai synthesizers for less than £200, but the K1 seems to be the only one that's left. But that's not such a bad thing. Again, it's another very interesting form of synthesis, and it uses a very basic form of wavetable manipulation in order to do its thing. Just to clarify that, it's not wavetable in the modern sense of where one waveform sort of morphs into another. It's more a case of you have a great number of waveforms which can then be combined together, and you can use envelopes to create something which sounds a bit sort of morphy, but in actual fact all you're doing is crossfading. While that might sound a little bit naff, it is actually a very good synth, and again has quite a unique sound. There's no filter, so programming is really about balancing waveforms with low harmonic content against those with high harmonic content and mixing to produce a pleasing sound. One of its strongest features is actually the amplitude modulation. Now, this is particularly good because you get two lots of it. You've got 4 oscillators, and each pair, i.e. 2 pairs, each one has its own amplitude modulation. In terms of versions, there's a Mark I and a Mark II. The difference being that the Mark II has built-in effects, relatively simple, but it does have things like digital reverb, and it also has additional drum sounds. The other thing that's worth considering is that there are quite a selection of form factors. So the K1 in its standard format is a 5-octave polysynth, but it also comes as a desktop version and a rack version. So really you've got quite a choice depending on what you prefer in your setup. Run through some of the other key points. So first of all, programming. Now this synth is actually very well thought out. It has a relatively small number of buttons, but it's very logical and it's pretty straightforward to get to what you want. It's not overly menu diving and you get used to it pretty quickly. Is there an editor available for it? Well, there is always MIDI Quest. I've not found anything else, but there could well be something there. So if you know of anything which is a decent editor, then let me know. But there is a way around it. It does have an emulator, and the good news is it's free and it sounds very, very good. It's certainly worth trying out if you wanted to check whether you get on with the programming and to find out whether you like the sort of sounds that it produces. I'll leave a link for that one. You can transfer patches between the K1 and the emulator, so that could be a way to program away from the synth. But to be honest, learning to program synth's not such a big deal with this one. So let's talk about effects. It was the Mark II which had the added reverb, and it's pretty basic. It's really you've got a collection of presets and you can adjust the amount of that effect which is applied to the sound, and that's it. In terms of flexibility of the sound though, I think it's probably a little more flexible than the CZ series, but still, is it going to cover everything? Well, no, not really. It's a niche synth, but a little more flexible than some. Okay, it's time to talk about the DX series. Now, while there were many DX synthesizers, the one that most people would like to get their hands on is the DX7, and sadly it's not possible to get that for £200 anymore unless you found a particularly beaten up version. But most of the rest of them are available. Now the dividing line is between the 6 operator and the 4 operator synths, and the DX7, DX7 Mark II, etc. That's all 6 operator and therefore more expensive and more capable. And the 4 operator synths are the ones that we're going to talk about. Now there's quite a few choices here. You've got the DX9, which was released at the same time as the DX7. And then there's the DX21, DX27, DX100 and the DX11. Now these are all similar in their capability. The 21 has a chorus and they all have some variations in one way or another. But the one that stands out the most would be a DX11, and you'd perhaps be pushing the price on this one a little bit here. The DX11 is different in that it supports waveforms other than sine waves. So it's essentially a TX81Z with a keyboard attached. Effects tend to be basic or non-existent on these 4 operator FM synths, but the DX11 again has the best of the bunch with things like pan, delay and a chord function. While DX synths have a reputation for difficult programmability, my experience has shown that it wasn't too bad, but that was actually on a DX7 some time ago. I managed to get my head around it fairly quickly. The thing is, it's not really a problem. There are many editors out there which can simplify the whole process and give you a good overview. Now, looking at emulators, well, there's DX, which is particularly well known. Arturia also do a DX7 VST, and I think there are many others, as well as many pieces of software which expand on the FM formula. How useful is it to have one of these? As a synth collector, I'd probably be interested in a DX11 in very good condition, but I'd also probably want the original DX7 because it's such an iconic synthesizer. So, in terms of flexibility, again, it's a very specific sound FM, isn't it? So it has its place, good for bass lines and good for twinkly noises, but for lush pads, maybe not so much. So it's not going to cover every single bass. So again, it depends what you're looking for. So a quick word about the prices. Overall, these 4-operator DXs are pretty cheap, quite often going for as little as £100, and you can get them even cheaper if you're willing to fix them. There's one main exception, and that's the DX100. Because of its miniature size, it's more desirable because it's the sort of thing that people could put into a live rig. So if you want a cheap entry-level classic synth, then one of these DXs is definitely worth considering. Okay, we're getting close to the end now. So I've got one last main section, and that is the Roland D series. Now, sadly, the D50 is going to be out of range for anybody on a budget. Quite often you'll be looking at something around £500, although recently I've seen them going for under £200, but I think those were just sort of auction flukes, and for whatever reason there weren't enough people looking out for a D50. But certainly one person got a particularly good sale of around £160 recently, which was, wow, pretty amazing. Let's go back to the luck that most of us normally have and the standard prices. So the D50 is out of range, but there are three other options: the D10, the D20 and the D5. The D10 is very similar to the D50, but it uses cheaper components and was therefore sold at a cheaper price. But it still sounds very good. It sounds quite similar to the D50. Sometimes people say it sounds a little bit more gritty. And I've even heard some people suggest that the D10 is the true classic of the bunch and not the D50 after all. Although I do think that was probably a bit of confusion going on. The D20 is very similar to the D10, but with some extra features, floppy drive storage, and you have a sequencer. And then last and least is the D5, which is an even more cut down version of the D10, where they remove the effects. So yeah, I mean, I suppose you could go for that if you want, but you probably don't want to be spending more than £100 on something like that. Not if you can get a D10 for a little bit more. Now, I've found that these synths can go really quite cheap, more like 150. If you find one that needs a bit of work doing to it, it's particularly grubby or some of the switches don't work and you need to get a soldering iron out, then you can get it for under £100 even. I think the D10 I got, I think cost about 60, something like that. It was quite a while ago. So definitely worth considering. Let's go through some of the main points. So programming, like the DX series, this is a difficult one, but there are programmers out there, so that shouldn't be a problem. So while the D50 has an emulated version in the Roland Cloud and the D05 boutique unit, the D10 doesn't have that. There is no emulation of the D10 that I'm aware of, and it's unlikely there ever will be, because if you've got D50, then what's the point? So you are going to get something which is a bit more unique. The next thing is the flexibility of the unit. The D10 is based on PCM samples which can then be manipulated with envelopes, can be layered, can be ring modulated. There's quite a lot that you can do with them. As a result, there's quite a broad spectrum of sounds, and whereas some of the other synths that I've talked about wouldn't be so good in terms of pads or rich pads, the D10 could probably pick up the slack in that area. And the last aspect is the effects. So the D10 and D20 probably have the best effects out of all of this bunch, and that really again helps it to be a decent all-rounder. So what would be my choice if I was to pick any of these synthesizers? What would I go for? That's a tricky one. It would make sense to go for the latest and greatest. I think I'd probably go for the D10. I do like the unique synthesis methods of the others. They're really quite unique. They're all worth checking out, even though some of them are relatively limited, certainly by today's standards. So that's my choice. I hope that helps you choose anything you might want to get. If you think there's anything I've missed or if I've got anything wrong, then please feel free to drop it in the comments and I will try and respond to you. Okay, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.